concepto del trabajo que hizo a lo largo del año. Con esto cerramos la presentación del 5º número de los que pudimos hacer durante este año y medio, desde el último Visiones Sonoras. Y realmente, pues agradecerte mucho, Kevin, por el esfuerzo, por la iniciativa lo hablamos cuando viniste a la residencia, hace 2 años o algo así.
No, es en
¿Cuándo fue que?
marzo,
Marzo
de
22.
2023. Creo.
23.
23.
Ok, son 1 año y medio. Y en 1 año hizo todo el trabajo, buscó los artículos, y llevó a la gente, hizo todo el trabajo, así que mil gracias por ese esfuerzo. Y por supuesto, como dije, si no tuviéramos el apoyo de la ENES y de la Secretaría de Cultura y Fundación Telefónica, pues no sé qué habría en lugar de la revista, pero probablemente no existiría eso. Y bueno, muchas gracias también a la gente del CEMAS, por supuesto, Fran, la página y toda la coordinación técnica, y también a Romina, aquí está Romy, por toda la coordinación de todos los números, de todo este tiempo, la revisión. Ella es el enlace con el editor, con el diseñador, con los editores, las revisiones, las mayúsculas, las minúsculas, las arrobas, dice. Así que mil gracias por eso. Tengo que decir, tú me desmientes, Romy, si estoy mal, que esta en particular fue una revista sencilla, porque el trabajo que hizo Kevin fue increíble. No todas son así de maravillosas como esta, y no lo digo siempre, pero ahora sí lo digo porque fue así. Fue un trabajo súper eficiente, en tiempo siempre. Entonces hemos tenido experiencias de todo, pero esta en particular. Pero muchas gracias, Romina, por toda esa coordinación, que es mucho trabajo. Y pues finalmente a ti otra vez, Kevin, como editor. Y bueno, comenzamos las charlas de esta mañana, que entiendo que tienen un cambio. ¿O nada, quieres que nada más se recorre una cosa, no? ¿O ya? No, adelante.
No, por favor, yo me callo, no tengo problema. Sí, bueno, no importa, eso lo voy a decir después porque no lo tengo, la página no la tengo abierta y iba a presentar en realidad a Kevin, pero ahora después les comento esto. Entonces, bueno, Kevin Patton es un músico y tecnólogo creativo cuyos proyectos a menudo incluyen enfoques novedosos para la interacción física y computacional en contextos expresivos. Sus intereses de investigación abarcan sistemas tecnológicos expresivos automatizados y de agencia, visualización, pensamiento musical y diseño centrado en el ser humano. Entre sus proyectos recientes se encuentra el desarrollo de experiencias web inmersivas, liderazgo en iniciativas de diseño comunitario y composición de música electroacústica. Kevin es el fundador del Studio Orpiment, un estudio de diseño interactivo enfocado en el diseño de experiencias inmersivas y la mezcla y masterización de música. Es profesor asistente de diseño de interacción en la Escuela de Artes Corcoran de la Universidad George Washington. Posee un doctorado y una maestría en la Universidad de Brown. Fue investigador invitado en la Sorbonne, Universidad 4, durante la primavera de 2009.
Thank you. Gracias a todos. And thank you everybody at CEMAS for helping put this issue together. It is as follows tradition. It's in both Spanish and in English, and especially thank you for help with with handling some of these Spanish formatting and grammatical issues, and Romina for coordinating all of that. I'm really happy with the way everything came out. I think it looks beautiful. It looks wonderful online, like all of the issues. And I know that the authors were very excited to be included in this publication and to be included in the work that CEMAS really does. So the idea of this issue is about automation and expression. And what I mean by this is that for many years, parts of the different musical communities that I participated in, which were pretty varied. There's acoustic composition, electroacoustic composition, jazz improvisation, and kind of more shall we say, down-to-earth music-making practices, including some sort of folk music and pop music. And there has always been this underlying current of criticism but criticism of the use of certain technological advances that we have developed, many of which have originated in the electroacoustic community, as this kind of false dichotomy between kind of the synthetic creative impact of technological tools versus the kind of more human one-to-one strumming a guitar, if you will, kind of approaches to music making. And especially in much of the jazz community that where I really learned music, is where I really come from, is from jazz community. I had this idea I'd be a jazz guitar player and I'd make lots of money, which is pretty absurd. But a lot of people in that community, especially let's say 10 years ago when these ideas were formulated, had a very strong reaction against the idea of using any kind of technology or any kind of computational technology in the creation of their own music. I think a lot of this has shifted with new generations, but and so a lot of the theoretical arguments that were being discussed around this were really looking at technological interventions and automation around virtuosity, chops, and musicality. And as I begin to unpack this, I really think that this criticism was really kind of positing like a moral conundrum based on the way in which performers and composers use the technologies, right? And there was this anxiety about whether or not new technologies were replacing the traditional labor needed to learn one's instrument, or if computation was creating a shortcut to the deep understanding that composers, many of the people in this room, have developed over years of practice, of hard-earned understanding of the way that they have developed a personal style, or around the way that certain kinds of sonorities operate together. And it was so there was this implication that there was some sort of moral transgression that was happening around around this idea of using computational means, algorithmic means, to be able to generate creative music material. And of course, the most egregious example of these kinds of transgressions were, for instance, the criticisms around people playing with backing tracks, which is now a common practice for a large-scale, spectacle-oriented musical presentation, like Taylor Swift, for instance, or Beyonce or something like this. There's lots of tracks that are happening in there. And then, of course, lip-syncing, right, which the craziest example is the Milli Vanilli thing in the 80s, where that was just, how dare they use that? Now that's almost... Also, for performers that use lots of dancing, they lip sync frequently, right? So all of these moral, like the performance practice and the kind of the capital drive of using spectacle as a way to generate financial value has overrode any of these kinds of considerations. And so when I was thinking about these ideas and the conundrum they presented to me personally, was that I felt that there was a real misunderstanding in the kind of way that the moral argument is getting set up around this kind of contradiction between the synthetic and the human. And so and a lot of this was, around labor and technology, and a lot of these arguments can be seen in other industries, especially today with artificial intelligence and the implications for labor, no matter what industry you are in, whether it be creative or not. But these anxieties are resurfacing through the use of artificial intelligence and those new technologies, large language models that are here. This issue isn't about that. All right, this issue isn't about artificial intelligence, large language models, of any of those technologies. This issue is about how we as composers, improvisers, and performers are able to kind of harness some of the capacity that computation offers us as a way to creatively think around ways to include new experiences, new sounds, and how we kind of approach dealing with that conundrum in a practical, project-oriented sense. Right, so this idea, right, that our use of automation becomes an aspect of our creative voice, implies that we actually begin to share an intimacy with these tools, and they become a larger part of creative practice and the delivery systems of creative output, right? And so this is kind of like a combinatorial reality, that this intimacy of the personal and the collaborative are not just mediated, but they're often enabled now by computational technology. And this suggests, I argue, that we share materiality and agencies with these systems. So in a sense, these systems come alive. I don't talk about him here, but the French theorist Ph.D. had this great idea. He wrote this incredible book for me, blew my mind, right? It's called The Phantom Limb, right? And it's about constructions of the musician with their instruments, a big section about this idea, how we conceive of that, so much so that many pop musicians adopt like the name of their instrument as a part of their moniker, right? So in American pop music, you have Johnny Guitar Watson as an example of this. And so there's this kind of fusion that happens between the instrument and the person, right? And so in the traditional sense, if you spend 8 hours a day, practicing Beethoven, yeah, you have a real relationship with that piano. And you also, just like when we spend hours and hours a day working on a Max Patch or working on creating the automations inside of Ableton or whatever system we're using, it creates that kind of same materiality and the same kind of intimacy around the kind of epistemology of music making for us. And so I asked many different people who have different practices around the use of these kinds of technologies to contribute. So the first article, written by Heather Stebbins. So Heather is primarily has a practice around kind of live performance with modular systems and cello. And she's very interesting, makes quite beautiful music. I suggest you all look her up if you have the opportunity. Challenges traditional notions of the solitary artist. So for her, it's part of community building, right? And exerting complete control over medium, this idea of authorship and power. That she believes that these approaches of incorporating automation, the shared agency of the capacity of people to use creative tools in a way they may not have had access to, right? Access is another important aspect of this, right? Not all of us can play, Beethoven's Tempest Sonata. So, so there's a question of access here. And so she articulates this position about, questions regarding authorship and intentionality push us or her to consider the future of creativity and how we operate in that, right? Not as sole creators, but as part of a larger interconnected network of influences and inputs. And I think there she's expanding the idea of musician into, almost into the idea of creator, right? And we now have this model of content creator instead of musician, which is another conundrum. Again, I'm not dealing with that here, but that can operate in a similar kind of gray area or moral challenge, because as people have access to tools that require less experience to be able to create a convincing musical experience for people who don't necessarily know or care what it is that it takes to make a piece of music, traditional hierarchies around access to academy and audiences begin to kind of collapse a little bit, right? It's a positive reading of the content creator. The negative reading is that the beauty, the intimacy, the delicacy of the personal is lost in the use of the preset. I don't know, many of you probably have, you have students and they bring you in and like the first class, everybody's tempo is the default tempo of the DAW, right? So right, that would be an example of how without that experience, without the personal relationship to the materiality of the tools that you use and this idea of agency makes us less rich in terms of experience, while at the same time creates access for people who may not know as much or may not have access to the education and the tools, or even like large computational items that cost thousands and thousands of dollars. There's many people, most of the world can't afford that. So, so there is an aspect of this. I think Heather kind of points that out very interestingly. She also has this idea of generative automation, and that's how she describes the way she uses control voltage or CV signals as parameter controls, which I think is pretty interesting. This idea of parameter control comes up a lot for a lot of people, different practices. So, and that's pretty fascinating. Fascinating to me as we think about parameter control as a kind of a real-time data streams, in the sense that a vibrating string or a vibrating column has aspects of data that we control with our hands as performers. The next article is Jeff Kaiser's piece about the automation of surprise, In Jeff's practice, as he articulates, what he tries to do is to build, and around this idea of agency again, or maybe, I don't know, this is a synthetic agency, but then I'm back in my loop again. But he tries to build instances where, as he's performing, the computer does something that he couldn't have conceived. So he tries to build these kinds of series of kind of, they're not really neural networks, they're a little, I mean, he uses that vocabulary, and I think he builds these kind of logic lattices that are very similar to the way the neural networks operate. But he has this idea of using the automation to create surprise. So it becomes a provocation for him, whose primary practice is oriented towards improvisation with trumpet and interactive electroacoustic materials. Right. So then there's Juan Parra and Jonathan Impet's article. Both of them work in Belgium, in Ghent, in the Orpheus Institute. They do a lot of amazing, interesting work. But they have this duet, and so they talk about this 3 states of wax piece, right? And so they have this really interesting concept of hauntology, which is a philosophical concept that is trying to talk about the presence of something that actually isn't there, but that feels like it is there. And so in their way of performing and the way that they construct the systems with which they interact to create an experience for people, this idea of the presence of a musical presence that is absent but felt is one of the parts of their conception that they try to bring out. It's fascinating, right? And so, and the next article is Carolina Carrizo, whose video work we saw with Danielle in Wednesday night's concert, which was amazing. And so here she talks about her piece, O Tiempo Todo, for bass flute and processing for audio and video in real time. And so what's interesting about this is she takes a lot of these concepts and applies them to a multimedia system rather than just an audio system. And she has a really interesting use of feedback, both video feedback and audio feedback. And she also looks at the challenges of incorporating computer vision and gestural estimation as a control feature for both the audio and visual aspects of her work. And she details strategies for defining interactions while using gestures and sensors as part of one's composition. It's a really, it's quite detailed article, and she's kind of dealing with all of the pieces of everything all at once, right? So there's the video, there's the audio, there's the multimedia, there's the sensors, there's the gestures, there's the estimation, there's the capacity of a computer to be able to kind of articulate all of this at the same time, which, despite all of our computational power these days, is still can be difficult in the way that you set up the system. And it's really fascinating. So Carlos Suarez Sanchez's Noise and Subjectivity, for his article, he looks at stochastic and noise-based possibilities that create a sense of unpredictability, how that can be useful to a composer. So he provides in great details approaches for using noise-based methods in the analog domain. So he includes circuit designs of the way in which he approaches generating these things in the analog design. And his circuit diagrams and strategies can be seen to point to the materiality of the circuits. So where before some of our authors and myself are talking about the materiality of the computational aspects of, say, parameter control as they relate to a live performance, here he's talking about the materiality of circuitry, which of course has electricity, which are electrons, which is not logic and not ones and zeros. So it has a different kind of operational component. I always think of the computer as you have to make sure that you tell it everything that it has to do. But with circuitry, you just kind of manage it to keep it within the bounds. Otherwise, it just overcomes the banks of the river and everyone drowns. So it's a different kind of perspective on how you might manage some of these systems. Barry Wands, exploring the practical implications of semi-indeterminacy and randomized automation and ambisonic sound diffusion, is about a plugin, about a reverb plugin, essentially, a reverb plugin that he built using the Chinese zodiac as a way to kind of articulate collections of parameters or presets. Right? The presets are the unelegant way to say collections of mappable parameters, right? And so these are based on the Chinese zodiac, and he spends a good amount of time talking about how certain aspects of the Chinese zodiac have stochastic or randomized methods in them as well. You can think of the I Ching when we roll dice or something like this, right? So they have randomized aspects of them that map very well to this idea of parameterization of a reverb plugin. Our very own Francisco and Rodrigo look at genetic algorithms as a creative output, and they show us an implementation for Max for Live, right? That in the context of automation for expression, as it locates the creative process deep inside the algorithm, the genetic algorithm as an automated material generator gives insight into the systemic qualities of the design of musical material. And so I highlight this quote, las diversas técnicas utilizadas para el cálculo de aptitud, cruzamiento y mutación brindan un sinnúmero de posibilidades que permiten al compositor controlar el nivel de variedades entre las secuencias de datos generados. So so there's this kind of control aspect inside of the genetic algorithm that allows the sequence to be manipulated, and they built a Max for Live plugin. It was pretty amazing. Fabian Squiguila proposes a tool set for interactive environments and a set of digital luthier tools. And this is pretty interesting. For me, one of the most interesting aspects of his MNT system is that he provides a model of collaborative performance through a real-time collaborative performance, so it creates collaborative systems. And I think this is a great area for future research. The idea that we can use technology and sensor-based or computer vision-based control systems to create relationships between multiple performers that essentially generate or create a collaborative electroacoustic music making system, right? And you can see this being used very immediately in a kind of installation type setting where guests can come in and explore together, and then the relationship between them is able to generate sounds and be able to map across different kinds of experiential domains like loud or soft, dense or open, dissonant or harmonic. So you can see, all of a sudden we're beginning to think about how we engage each other as humans. So as we form a team or as we form a group that works together for a collective goal, in this case, the model of the automation begins to enable in a very small sense, maybe the beginnings of ideas about how to think through community and collaboration with technological tools. This is a very fascinating aspect of his work that I think would be, that is very worthwhile. Richard Graham proposed a live performance system with guitar, where he uses computational agents and improvisatory co-performance. So he looks at multimodal music input for guitars and its complexity, while quite similar to Squiguila, spending a significant amount of time on how one might approach mapping systems, right? How to draw from performance data and extract features as a method of control. He notes that for complex multisensorial and gestural systems that attempt to route performance data into a control mapping, there is often significant human intervention. And this acknowledgement reveals how automation, or perhaps especially complex automation, is still firmly situated in the realm of human activity rather than the computational autonomy. as the way we might romantically imagine it in, like, say, the Terminator movies or something. And this management of complex computational systems, especially in the context of a kind of bespoke or unique, personalized, expressive usage, can flip the paradigm of the human being mediated by technology to the technology being mediated, even requiring human intervention. And then the final article is written by an architect, Andrea Dietz, and I asked her to just, what are some thoughts? She wanted to share some of her thoughts about sound and space, and for her, it was really about the experience of sound and space. And as an architect, thinking through lots of perhaps the spectacle component and the co-presence and co-mingling of a person and an environment, and how they act together to create an experience that cannot, ontologically speaking, exist without the other. And so this is especially resounding when scale is considered, right? Scale is an important concept here because it demonstrates that the sound worlds can renegotiate the terms of the space that it is in through scale. And her examples are looking at the large pop spectacles of, say, Taylor Swift and Beyonce, that are able in these large stadiums to use these kind of complex live sound rigs to create or mimic intimacy despite the gigantic size of these spaces. So one is able to kind of transform physical space through sound. Said differently, one can transform the experience of space through the construction or through sound design. And for me, what is striking about Dietz's observations is it shows how algorithmic complexity and the capacity of creating the virtual, right? Because that is that is an aspect of virtuality, right? This use of the sound system, right? To create, the classic example, the crooners, when the microphone came, they could speak like this. Hello, everybody. How are you? Right? And so that enabled a new type of singing, and it created a mimicry of intimacy, right? Like as if you were close. And so it's the same idea, just extended in this gigantic scale. And so the capacity of creating the virtual is then shaping the actual, right? So people are having these experiences, and then they're no longer virtual for them. They are experienced as real, like the technology recedes. And I'm sure if you have younger students in any of your classes, the understanding of what's happening behind an app often is missing because everything is just so apparent. So it just becomes a kind of new natural system, right? And, which we need, I guess, virtual physicists to decode. So that symbiosis between the virtual sonic architecture and the sounding of architecture, then kind of this reveals a rupture. Ultimately, the outcome and the negotiation between computational agency and the expansion of human creativity into human creative systems design is precarious, hauntological even. Dietz's references to huge capitalist spectacles of the stadium concert should not be construed as only setting a context for how space and sound have entered a new state, but rather that the urge towards the spectacular and its transference to the virtual product experience is an expression of power, economic power, technological power, and personal power. Thank you.